Hey, hi. Okay, I'm going to go on the second part of the analysis on the inflation threats that's happening. This video is quite useful, which I've researched on. It's just going to show you a bit about the relevant clips.
Go check them out. Okay, so why can the Fed not be hawkish now? Because some folks are saying, hey, the Fed should just shock us now anyway. And they might. But why can't they, or probably why can't they shock us now? Well, again, when we have war fear, we already expect that aggregate demand is likely to go down for the reasons I talked about with inflation likely heading down, or demand for products and travel or whatever iPads going down, amplified by the velocity of money. The Fed's unlikely to want to double clamp down on the economy. Because if inflation starts going down and demand goes down and the Fed hikes, then you could have something worse that happens, which we'll talk about in a moment. So fear tends to lower aggregate demand, which in time should lower inflation naturally without having to
Yeah, take note of these 2 points, very important. Fear will reduce aggregate demand generally, doesn't need Fed to intervene.
hawk, right? But if you have low demand and inflation's going down and you decide to hawk, what do you end up with? Well, a potential worst case scenario. Nobody wants this, okay? This would be very, very bad. We do not want this. Stagflation. Why? Because stagflation can lead to what we call regime collapse. This is where literally the dollar could just disappear. And the reason you get
Okay,
regime
I just stop you here and show you what's the meaning of stagflation. Stagflation actually means that it's price continue to rise even though uh, the price will remain high. Inflation rate is high, means that the price will remain as high, but the economic growth is slow. And unemployment is high, but which is not the case here. So if Fed is hawkish, right, they might tilt towards this direction.
collapses because during stagflationary environments, you fail both of the priorities of the Fed. Maximum employment it becomes a failure because people get laid off in stagflationary environments. And when there's high inflation, you certainly don't have price stability. So now you're losing on both points. Right now, the Fed's only losing on one. We're good on number one. If point number one is max employment or max E, we're good here. We've won. We just haven't won on price stability. We're kind of like, let's wait and see. Let's hopefully see if we get price stability without killing Maxi. So anyway, this is why I don't actually think that the Federal Reserve is likely to hike too aggressively. So what the Federal Reserve has to do right now is they have to buy time because we don't know what's going to happen. So they've got to buy time. Buying time generally means the Fed is becoming dovish, right? They're relaxing. They're not being as aggressive. And see, these are just some scenarios. We don't exactly know what will happen. But if we have a short war and we bought time, maybe we start getting inflation that fades, which keep in mind, inflation fading does not mean going to zero. It just means disinflation. Like instead of seeing 8% inflation, now we're seeing 6.5, 6, 5.5, 5. That's disinflation, right?
Yeah, this is
And this
important.
could lead to a soft landing, and you buy the dip
Soft
on
landing.
this. You buy the dip on war fears, you buy the dip on drama, on reports, on Fed Day, whatever. You buy the dip, you hope for the soft landing. However, if we do reduce aggregate demand too much, it's possible we could go to a recession, but it's unlikely that in a short war, demand would be reduced too much for a recession. So the bigger concern would be, what if we have a long war? The Federal Reserve buys time during a long war, aggregate demand goes down. Well, now one of two things can happen. Inflation can fade, disinflation. Okay, great, back to soft landing. Hopefully soft landing before we've reduced demand too much for a recession. Or if we don't get inflation down, we have a longer war, and this inflation persists and the war inflation persists, well, then the Fed's just going to have to force a recession. Forcing a recession is basically when the Fed Paul Volckers us, and they raise rates some ridiculous sum, 5, 6, 7%, or whatever, instantly, and then everybody freaks out. The markets freak out. Okay, so let's come over here. Now, this is really important to pay attention to going forward, and this all has to do with the Federal Reserve, of course. The Federal Reserve has a secret public enemy number one. And the reason I call it the secret public enemy number one is because a lot of people say the Fed only cares about max employment and prices. But, but they have a secret public enemy, and they're called inflation expectations. That's sort of the collective enemy here, inflation expectations. And we actually had good news on this. We actually had what looked like a peak. Inflation expectations kept going up, and then ding, we actually peaked in roughly, actually probably peaked in around December here, because when we got the January numbers here, the inflation expectations for 1 year out, based on the New York Fed's survey of consumers, went from 6% to 5.8%. This is the first time we've actually seen an inflection point down since October of 2020. So it's been a while. It's been about a year and a half, and we finally have this potential peak here in inflation expectations. Problem is, the longer this war goes on, what do we think is going to happen to inflation expectations? Well, they're good right now, but I expect in the future they're going to end up turning bad. And that's because, again, as long as the war goes on, people are going to see gas prices go up, and of course, consumer expectations for inflation are going to go through the roof.
Yeah, so I'll just wrap it up here. If you see now, the next question is whether the war is going to be a long one or a short one. If it's a long one, if Russia is going to invade Moldova, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, all the other non-NATO countries as well, uh, maybe accidentally start a nuclear war by, putting fire on one of the Ukraine nuclear reactor, which is happening now. Then sustained inflation, um, the inflation threat from the war may not be transitory, may be persistent. So yeah, I'll wrap it up here. So I will keep updating on my thoughts as we go along. Thank you.